All right, let's jump into the discussion, and people will continue to pile in here. Okay, welcome. This is the LaRouche Pack Saturday night discussion. It's August 21st. I'll be moderating the discussion tonight, Mike Steger. And we've got Ben Denniston. I think this is the fourth week. And as you could probably tell from the title of this discussion, it's not outside the confines of the ongoing political collapse of what you might call the Biden collective, or in some ways it's the ancien regime, an oligarchical structure, the neoliberal system post-World War II, that perhaps no one better than Biden represents, having been in office literally nearly 50 years now in Washington, representing these oligarchical corporate and pro-war interests. Now, the bigger question is not, is the Afghanistan pullout a catastrophe, a building crisis for potentially tens of thousands of Americans still in Afghanistan? We pulled out of Bagram Air Base, which was our point of military control and stability in the Kabul area on July 2nd. It's been over 6 weeks. So this was a precipitous but obvious scenario given the incompetence. Now that incompetence, as many people have stated, including Barbara Boyd on our website, and I would encourage people to go to larouchepack.com as well as check out our YouTube channel for other video content. This was something that could easily have been avoided, and it was done with intent, and the implications are not yet fully understood. So how long can Joe Biden himself remain the puppet of this current administration? There was a Rasmussen poll out that expressed increasing demise, and there's increasing criticism even coming out of MSDNC, CIA News Network, CNN, and other locations identifying, a shared criticism. So many people are now asking, they're not just randomly deciding because of the Afghan catastrophe to jump in and dogpile on Joe Biden, who was literally caught blatantly lying to the American people yesterday. As soon as he opened his mouth, when he's lying, he said something like, this is the greatest logistical success and mission ever accomplished in human history. So such lies are not hard to contradict. So even his own Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon, and other administrative figures are contradicting the president within the same day. Now the question is there a plan? Now, in some degree, this is a scorched earth policy. The open borders, massive crime, massive violence, anarchistic kind of youth mobs in the streets, perpetual COVID lockdowns, now vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, to some degree ineffective vaccines. Pfizer has shown itself to be largely much less effective than Moderna in some cases from the Mayo Clinic. So all of these things are in the air, masking children, fights between school districts and state legislators and state governments, mandates from the federal government, really in many cases ruled by fiat from governors or other kind of poobahs on the local level. All of this has been an intended program to destroy what's really the core of the United States, both its constitutional republic and the sense of a productive class of people, small businessmen, areas of industry. The same has been true with globalization. That's destroyed much of our manufacturing and industrial base and many of the skill levels that are required to be a productive and healthy economy. The same is true, as Ben's going to address tonight in some ways, the Green New Deal, which is meant to be much like the Afghanistan catastrophe, just a total economic catastrophe. So the stage we're in discussion on tonight is perhaps more obviously than ever before a sense of we the people, as our Constitution makes clear, have to bring to bear a more perfect union, a sense of a coherent mission for the American people, for our nation towards the world, and that we are responsible, the experts, whether it's in politics, law, public health, science, economy, you name it, music, culture. The experts have failed. The academics have failed. The paradigm, the new liberal system has failed. So the question is, what are we building today? There may be all kinds of talk and gossip about what's happening with Biden. The most important thing is the American people have to weigh in heavy with a quality of leadership and clarity of what's required. And I think to that extent, Ben is going to help shape that orientation tonight as he has the last few weeks. So Ben, with that introduction, I'd like to hand it off to you and get the discussion going tonight.
All right, Mike. Glad to be on again. Should be a fun discussion today. So with the collapse of the Biden collective on this foreign policy, on the Afghan policy, I think we got to really take to heart what Mike just said about stepping up and providing the real leadership that this nation needs, because we need to rebuild this country. We need to reject the policies, not just of the Biden administration, but going back really 2 generations. We had a short interlude with Trump, and he fought on a lot of the key issues, and he had tremendous opposition. He made progress on a number of fronts, rejecting the Paris Climate Agreement, rejecting the Green New Deal type policies, promoting nuclear power development, putting the space program back on the right track, fighting against NAFTA and the globalization policies. So really on a lot of the key points that Lyndon LaRouche and LaRouche PAC have been fighting on for decades, we had a push in the right direction. And then now we have this Biden collective craziness that's trying to reverse us on all these. So, with the collapse of this, senile, quite frankly, it's kind of sad to watch, really. I mean, some people have called this elder abuse. I think that's probably a good statement of it. You have this guy that just clearly does not know what's going on. He's being used by some very, very evil people for the purposes of destroying this country. I mean, I think that's clear. The people behind this policy hate the United States for what it represents as a real constitutional republic, a real beacon against empire, the British Empire, imperialism more generally, and a promoter of creativity and human development. So we got to get back to that. That's, it's not enough just to get rid of Biden, get rid of this whole Washington, D.C. swamp, throw all these guys out. We actually have to come forward and lead, bring the country in the right direction. So one aspect of that, like we're going to talk about, is continuing the attack on this Green New Deal, but laying out the alternative. What is a real energy program from the standpoint of economy, the science of physical economy as developed by Lyndon LaRouche, and what do we need to fight to implement? So that's what we're going to break down today, and then highlight some of the frontier work going on in fusion power, and what that looks like in an advancing economy. So hopefully this gives us a sense of what we're fighting towards. So I'm going to throw my slides on here. It looks like we're good to go. So we're talking about fusion power versus the Green New Deal. And just to put this in context, when we talk about the Green New Deal, it's a term, there's different proposals made. There's clearly an effort to hide the Green New Deal under what they call it, the quote unquote infrastructure bill and other variations of that. But in general, what you're looking at is this proposal, as Biden laid out to an international summit in April, of trying to push the United States to go to 100% CO2 free electricity by 2035. And that's the kind of thing you're seeing pushed in states like California, being discussed. European nations are pushing towards these kinds of goals: 2050, 2040, 2035, 100% so-called renewable or CO2 free electricity. Now, last week we took some time to go a little bit in depth in the whole CO2 issue, so I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to state outright that we don't need to be concerned about the rise of human CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So that premise motivating the whole thing should just be disregarded, quite frankly. But let's look at the actual impact of what this kind of program would have on the U.S. economy. It would devastate the U.S. economy. It would destroy the U.S. economy. no question about it. And when they talk about CO2 free electricity, you know, let's be clear, there's not really a support for nuclear power in there. You know, places where this kind of agenda is advancing, again, like take California, they're shutting down all their nuclear power plants. And what are they pushing? Wind, solar as the primary CO2 free sources of power. They're not building new hydropower. There's no push for new hydropower. There's no push for new nuclear power. You know, there's some little smattering of support in it in some of these bills. But when these guys in the Biden collective, the people behind the Great Reset, you know, the forces really behind this Green New Deal policy talk about the Green New Deal and CO2 free electricity, they're really talking about large scale wind and solar. So what does that mean? This is some stuff we've covered in some previous discussions. The material costs of wind and solar are far higher than any other source of power, of electricity. Here we have a breakdown from a DOE study from 2015, looking at the material inputs to provide a unit per unit of electricity produced. So to provide 1,000 gigawatt hours of electricity, this is the total tons, the total weight, tons of material inputs required to build the facilities to generate that electricity. And we can see wind and solar are the highest. If you kind of put hydropower aside, because the vast majority of the inputs for that is in the form of one material input, concrete. So you kind of just put that aside and you compare wind and solar with nuclear. Wind takes about 11 times the material cost to build the windmills to generate the same amount of electricity as a nuclear power plant. Solar, it's about 16 times higher, right? Why? Because these energy sources have inherently low energy flux density, as Mr. LaRouche would often talk about. There's only so much sunlight hitting the earth per square meter. There's only so much wind passing through the atmosphere. The actual amount of energy concentration, the amount of energy flowing through a certain area or volume per time is actually very low for these sources. So if you want to power an economy, a nation on these systems, on wind and solar, you got to cover vast arrays of territory, huge scopes of territory, hundreds of times larger land area than, again, compared to nuclear power, with windmills and solar panels to generate the same amount of electricity, right? So it's hugely physically costly for these sources. On the other side, obviously, there's no fuel input required, right? The wind is there, the sun is there. So, you know, that's supposedly the benefit of these sources, but again, they're incredibly costly. But on this side, it's worth comparing nuclear then against fossil fuels, chemical sources of electricity, natural gas, coal. The energy density of the weight of nuclear fuel, and we'll get into both fission and fusion towards the end, but the energy density, the energy weight of these sources, the energy per weight of these sources, of these different fuel sources is dramatically different. Coal is 15,000 times less energy per weight of the fuel. So if you have 1 ton of nuclear fuel, it would require 15,000 tons of coal to get the same amount of energy, right? A 15,000 fold difference. Natural gas, 7,500 fold difference, right? So you kind of have this, from a physical standpoint, you really see the benefit of nuclear power, right? On the material inputs to build the actual power generation systems themselves, wind, solar are far higher, nuclear is far lower. In terms of the fuel input, natural gas, coal are far higher, nuclear is again far lower. So this should give you a sense in physical terms, and we'll get a little more rigorous into the physical economics of this. Nuclear power, and again, fission, and in the future, fusion, is really the way to go. So let's, from this standpoint, from this physical, scientific, physical economic perspective, let's look at the Green New Deal. So the proposal is that's being floated 2035, 100% of the electricity generated without CO2 emissions. So just to make a very simple assumption as to what that might look like, I took from 2020 out to 2035, dropped natural gas and coal down to zero, kept hydropower and nuclear at their present levels, which might not be what these guys are actually proposing, and then expanded wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal at the same ratio they are presently relative to each other. So the so-called renewables, encapsulating wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, kept those at the same relative ratios and expanded that out. So this is what the and this is in terms of total electricity generated and consumed by the economy each year. That's what we're looking at here by the different fuel sources. So this is a depiction, an estimate, a fair estimate of what Biden's zero CO2 for electricity by 2035 might look like. But what will be required in terms of the physical material inputs to achieve that, which we were just looking at, right? So here is a depiction of what the estimated physical material input per by the different sources of electricity for the last 70 years. Hydroelectric, nuclear, natural gas, coal, and the renewables in terms of wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal. Here we're not looking at how much electricity does each generate, but we're looking at what's the total material inputs: concrete, steel, plastics, aluminum, cement, and so on. What's the total material inputs required to generate electricity from each of these sources as an estimate based on this 2015 DOE study. So we see where we're at currently. And if you were to apply the estimate we just gave for Biden's CO2 plan, CO2 reduction to zero by 2035 for the electricity sector, this is what you're looking at. A massive increase in the physical goods required to produce electricity. Because again, wind, solar, you're talking about 11 to 16 times more material inputs to generate the same amount of electricity as with nuclear power because of the energy flux density issue, right? So between 2020 and 2035, following our estimate of the Biden plan, you'd have to triple the total physical inputs into the electricity sector just to produce the same amount of electricity, right? That's inherently an entropic plan. If we want to look at what that looks like, combining everything we've looked at so far. So this is the estimate of the Biden plan. The blue dotted line there is electricity generation. So that's steady, right? It's been roughly the same annual electricity consumption in the United States from the year 2000 to 2020. That's not a good sign, but that's the reality of what's happened. And if you were to keep that steady and produce and consume the same amount of electricity each year out to 2035, but do it with this increase in renewables, you can see the vast increase of physical inputs. And here we have it broken down in terms of concrete in red, steel in blue, and other material inputs, plastics, aluminum, and so on. So in Mr. LaRouche's Science of Physical Economics, something that LaRouche PAC is continuing to develop, continuing to pursue, and is absolutely a crucial part of understanding how to fix the economy and how to really get us out of this mess and take us into a productive future. In those terms, in the terms of Mr. LaRouche's Science of Physical Economics, This is what you would call an entropic policy, an entropic program, right? You're increasing the physical input to get the same output. So every year from 2021 to 2035, you're having a higher and higher and higher input of physical goods required just to continue to produce the same level of electricity output, right? And we don't produce an infinite amount of physical goods. We produce a certain amount of physical goods. So if we have to give more and more of that total production that we produce to the electricity sector, that makes less and less and less available for other parts of the economy, right? This is an entropic process leading to a winding down of the economy, a collapse of the economy, driving up prices and lowering productivity across the board because of this type of entropic mode, devastatingly entropic mode in the energy sector. And I would posit you probably couldn't actually get there. The economy would probably collapse before you could actually reach what they're talking about. I don't think this would even be possible. We're just extrapolating values here. The economy is a real living physical process, and it can only do certain things. So I don't think this is even really a possible scenario without a dramatic population collapse in living standards. So again, this Green New Deal is catastrophic. And we've already seen the beginning of this. If you look at Europe and you look at the relation between wind and solar implementation and prices, you see it's absolutely clear. The more wind and solar you have, the higher the cost of electricity. Why? For the physical reasons we just covered, right? The more wind and solar you have per person implemented across all these different countries, the higher their electricity prices. You know, totally clear physical relation is demonstrated in this data here, right? The nations like Germany and Denmark, which had the highest level of wind and solar installed per person in those countries, have by far the highest electricity rates in Europe. And you're also seeing that in the United States. If you compare California, for example, where over the last 10 years, as shown here, you've had a major emphasis on building up large-scale wind and solar power. The electricity prices in California have grown year after year after year, where the rest of the country, minus California, the electricity prices have been pretty much flat, right? So in 2011, California was already starting, what, 50% higher than the rest of the 49 states averaged together in terms of electricity prices. And by 2020, you know, that's now like 100% higher. It looks to be about double, right? So, and this is at relatively low levels of implementation of wind and solar, right? If you were to try and go this 100%, you know, again, I don't think you could actually get there. But in the process of trying to get there, the prices will continue to rise and rise and rise, meaning people can't afford electricity. Companies are going to leave, industries are going to leave. We've already seen that in Europe. They're fleeing Germany where they can't afford the electricity prices. They're going other places. So again, this is an economic death blow, the Green New Deal. So what do we want instead? What is the kind of policy that Lyndon LaRouche promoted, that LaRouche PAC is promoting? Well, you want to go the opposite way. You want to go to a neg-entropic, an anti-entropic program. And the way you do that is by increasing the energy flux density of your sources of power and your sources of electricity, right? So let's relook at that exact same type of scenario, but instead of starting with the goal of zero CO2 emissions via large-scale wind and solar by 2035, let's do something different. Let's say by 2035, get rid of wind and solar, phase them out completely. You know, if your neighbor wants to have solar on his house, on his roof to supplement, that's fine, whatever. You know, if people want to use it for remote locations, certain conditions, that's one thing. I mean, it you know, might have some use in certain scenarios in that context. But for on the scale of the economy as a whole, large scale implementation on these, it becomes disastrous. right? So you phase out wind and solar. And let's say we want to double electricity production, and we want to do that through nuclear power. And that's something that we should really be talking about. Like we just saw earlier, electricity consumption in the United States has been pretty much flat for 20 years. And if you look at it in per capita terms, it's been going down. What does that reflect? It reflects lowering productivity. It reflects the loss of production and manufacturing and this whole crazy outsourcing globalization process, right? So if we were to actually reverse these crazy economic policies and begin producing here again and begin having well-paying productive jobs in the United States again, we would need to go through a reindustrialization process. We would need to build up infrastructure, all kinds of new infrastructure systems, and all of that would require more power, more electricity. So if you're talking about really saving the US economy, a very significant increase in electricity supplies will be needed. So I think something like doubling the electricity consumption, production and consumption in the United States in the next generation would be a fairly good place to start, to look at, to shoot for. So again, nuclear having far lower physical capital goods inputs to generate electricity and far lower fuel costs, fuel input requirements to generate electricity. So this is what my depiction of this alternative 2035 scenario would look like. We could call it the LaRouche Pact 2035 energy scenario. Wind, solar, biomass, geothermal are basically phased out. You know, if it's some minimal remnants, whatever, that's fine, but far less than it is currently. We'll just say hydro, coal, natural gas, we'll just keep all those at the present levels, just for sake of keeping this simple. And all the growth in electricity generation for the United States would be done by nuclear power, right? And this can be large scale nuclear power plants, this can be small modular reactors, this can be more advanced new nuclear technologies. All of that's coming online, could be developed more rapidly in the context of a real driver program. So this is what the future really would look like in the immediate sense, to really drive the economy forward while you're pushing for a crash program on fusion, which we'll talk about in a second. Vast increase in electricity generation through nuclear fission power. That's really what we want to be looking at. So what does this look like in terms of the physical goods required to produce this increase, right? So before, with the Biden plan, we had no increase in electricity, and we tripled our material inputs into the electricity sector. What are we looking at here under this LaRouche Pact program? An actual reduction in the total raw material inputs into the electricity sector, while doubling the electricity generated. This is a negentropic expression in the economy. The total, largely due to phasing out wind and solar, which again are 10, 11 to 16 times more material intensive than nuclear. Phasing those out and vastly increasing nuclear to end up doubling the electricity generation, again, as you see in the blue line, the blue dotted line, ends up having less total raw material input requirements than we're currently putting in, again, largely because of the current effort behind wind and solar. So to compare these two, the LaRouche Pact plan, negentropic, higher electricity generation with fewer material inputs required to achieve that. This is an expression of technology, and it's an expression of increasing energy flux density. Versus the Biden plan, an entropic plan, vastly increasing the inputs just to continue to produce the same level of output in terms of electricity generation, right? This is a very useful example of entropic versus negentropic or anti-entropic modes in a physical economy, as Mr. LaRouche developed the science of physical economics. So this should be what we're talking about immediately right now as an alternative to the Green New Deal. Let's talk about doubling electricity production, not keeping it the same, and let's do it through nuclear power on the immediate short scale, the next 15, 25 years. And at the same time, let's push into the future. Let's go to the next leap beyond just nuclear fission power, which is nuclear fusion, right? Nuclear fission, you're talking about the present form of nuclear power that exists in the United States and around the world that's producing electricity. You're taking heavy elements, large elements, like largely uranium, potentially thorium, you're splitting them, fissioning them, and releasing energy that way. With fusion, you're operating on the other half, the other side of the periodic table. You're looking at light elements, helium, hydrogen, potentially other light elements, boron, some other things, depending on what kind of fuels you're looking at. And you're fusing them together. You're combining them, combining two hydrogen atoms to create a helium atom. And you're getting an excess energy release through that fusion process, that way to generate electricity, right? So fusion is the next step. And you can look at it in one sense in terms of the increases in the energy density of different sources of fuel. If you look at chemical fuels and you look at a comparison of just the energy available in the fuel per weight of the fuel, you can get a sense of the increase. In terms of kilowatt hours, that's just a measure of the amount of energy. Kilowatt hours per kilogram, so again, how much energy per weight of the fuel, you see a succession, a growth in chemical forms of fuel, from wood to coal being, a good chunk, 50% higher than wood, petroleum being higher than, even higher than that, natural gas being higher than that. So you get this stepwise increase as we move to more energy dense chemical fuels. You get higher efficiencies. It becomes easier to produce more energy, produce more electricity for your economy, because you have more energy available per weight of the fuel, right? And that's been, you could trace out the progress of human civilization along these lines as well, which would be a whole nother discussion, that civilization, societies, economies have progressed through moving to more energy dense forms of fuel to power societies. But then we see a dramatic leap from chemical to nuclear. And now we're not talking about just acquiring the energy held in molecular structures, but we're actually talking about breaking nuclear structures and combining nuclear structures. And you see a leap of many orders of magnitude in energy density, right? So that's why, the kind of nuclear fuel that you would end up having at a nuclear power plant was whatever it was, 15,000 times more energy dense than coal, because the inherent energy availability in nuclear reactions and nuclear fuels is so much higher. So we see a leap from 5, 7.5, 15 with chemical fuels to a typical nuclear fission fuel that you're seeing typically used in current nuclear power plants of 1 million, right? Huge leap, right? You're not just doubling or tripling, you're going up orders of magnitude. If you don't count the fuel as its entirety, you just look at a fission reaction directly, you get a sense of the energy density really of not the fuel as a whole, because a lot of the fuel you don't end up using in a nuclear plant. But the direct reaction is even higher than that. But then if you look at fusion, for example, here, deuterium-tritium fusion, the fusion of two forms of hydrogen, is 90 million. So it's a huge, it's a good leap, order of magnitude leap, 2 orders of magnitude leap above what you have with even nuclear fission fuels. And then beyond that, you have matter, antimatter reactions, which would be a whole new domain. There's a lot more questions about how you would contain that kind of, how you'd actually harness the energy and get the antimatter and all that. But, this is something that, we've studied and working with Mr. LaRouche, looking again at the progress of society and the increase of the potential relative population density of societies. The anti-entropic growth of societies, of economies, is always connected to upshifts in the energy density of fuel sources and the energy flux density of the economy as powered by those more advanced fuel sources. So we can already know, based on the history of the development of human civilization and where we're at today, and what we know about these different power sources already, that we need to be massively implementing nuclear fission. And beyond that, we should be developing fusion. And generations down the line, that needs to become the dominant source of electricity as we look to maybe things more advanced like matter, antimatter, or potentially even new scientific territories we're not even aware of now, right? So there's this direct relation between human advance, technological advance in the economy, and progression up this stepwise increase of energy density, energy densities of different sources of fuel, powering higher levels of energy flux density of the economy as a whole. So where do we stand with fusion? I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of some stuff that's been talked about recently. This certainly isn't comprehensive. A lot more could be said and done on the subject. I think we'll be working on it more. But people probably saw these headlines. There's been a bunch of headlines just the last 2 or 3 days about a major breakthrough at the National Ignition Facility in California, at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories. This is a laser fusion system, which has been going on for a number of decades, where they compress a fuel pellet in a spherical chamber with a number of lasers coming in from all around and impacting on this one location and compressing the fusion fuel to try and ignite a fusion reaction. And they just announced that they've come the closest they have to, I believe, what they call ignition, when the energy applied directly to the fusion fuel, when you're comparing the energy applied directly hitting the fusion fuel to the energy generated by the fusion reaction of that fuel, you're going to try it. You want to get that into, you want to be able to get more energy out of the fusion reaction than you're putting in to generate it, obviously, right? That's something we haven't really gotten yet, that we're working towards, a net gain of energy released versus energy put in. So they've been struggling trying to get to that point, reach that break-even point, get beyond that break-even point. And this latest results are a significant step. They're now at 70%, where the energy released by the fusion reaction was 70% of the energy that was directly applied to the fusion fuel itself. So they're getting pretty close. That's a lot closer than they were a number of years ago. So this has drawn a lot of excitement. Obviously, you also have, I'm sure people are familiar with, the large ITER program. This is a large tokamak fusion plant fusion test system being developed in Europe, huge international program. That's progressing somewhat slowly, a little bit delayed, but that's advancing. But at the same time, as these kind of large scale government sponsored programs are kind of slowly making progress, and this is all stuff that all of these systems could have been developed decades ago. It's purely been a question of funding. The equivalent of the ITER design was proposed in the 80s, could have been built by the 90s, mid 90s probably. The NIF system, there were designs, the National Ignition, the laser system in California, original designs were for larger systems that could have been built that probably would have gotten us far past where we are now. So there's been progress, but it's been very slow, and it's been very hindered by a lack of funding, a lack of support for these large scale government programs. And in the last 10 years, we've seen something very interesting, which is the growth of smaller companies, private companies, and a lot of them getting venture capital, venture money to support their activities. This is an article that just came out just a few days ago from Bloomberg, where they provided a decent overview of some of the private initiatives that are going on. Here's just a quote from the article. They said, private sector fusion companies in North America and Europe attracted $300 million in investment in 2020. That's about 20% of their historical total, according to the research group Bloomberg NEF. And this year's total, 2021, may beat last year and 2019. Right? So throughout the last, couple decades of private funds into fusion research, 2020 was a significant leap upwards, and it's trending to be similar, if not higher, for 2021. So there's significantly more resources being put into some private initiatives for fusion. And just to highlight a couple of the ones that are out there, this is not a comprehensive list, but just to give you a sense of some of what's going on. In California, there's a company called TAE Technologies. They've actually been around for a number of years. They have over 900 patents. They've raised almost $1 billion in capital, and they've gone through 6 generations of test devices as we're moving closer and closer towards something that can actually demonstrate sustained fusion reaction that could generate electricity and become commercializable to actually provide power on the grid. So they're progressing, they're doing their work in California. There was recently some coverage in the New York Times of an outfit in Massachusetts called Commonwealth Fusion. This is basically a spin-off of people that worked at MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Research Center. And what they're pursuing is a track that was developed by certain scientists. Bruno Coppi was one of the leading pioneers of this area at MIT, of proposing a very more intense magnetic fields within tokamaks, right? So as the New York Times coverage said, that they hope that this month they will demonstrate a magnetic field that's almost twice the strength of ITER. ITER being, again, this large government-funded, government-supported international program being built in Europe, right? That's kind of like the flagship test tokamak system being developed. This MIT, Commonwealth Fusion outfit, they're looking at significantly higher strength magnetic fields, which leads to a smaller reactor overall, and potentially a more efficient system to generate fusion. So that's very interesting, and I'd be excited to see what results they have from trying to test these higher magnetic fields this month, according to this New York Times article. You have another company, General Fusion. So as described in this Bloomberg coverage, backed by Jeff Bezos, General Fusion is expecting to build a test facility in the UK that switches on by 2025. A commercial plant should follow well within a decade. Energy companies including ENI, Equinor, Cenovus, and Chevron have invested in fusion, according to Bloomberg NEF. Right, so another private outfit, they're looking at a little bit more of an interesting design for generating the fusion reaction, smashing in a number of pistons to kind of generate a compression shock wave on the plasma, while I believe also compressing with the magnetic field in order to generate the fusion reaction. But they're getting some support and progressing in their work. You have another interesting outfit called First Light Fusion. In some of their work, they say, rather than attempting to avoid instabilities, so they're talking about in these tokamaks and these big donut-shaped fusion devices, the plasma tends to do all kinds of weird stuff. It tends to deform and take different shapes and move in ways that they don't really want it to move according to their approach to trying to get the plasma confined, compressed, and hot enough to sustain a fusion reaction. It's been one of the big challenges with fusion power. And something that Mr. LaRouche talked about all the way back to the 70s and 80s, and a number of leading scientists that he was working with, was to kind of take the inverse approach. Rather than trying to make the plasma conform to a certain design you want in order to sustain the fusion reaction and generate the energy out of that, why not design your entire fusion device, your technology, around what the plasma seems to want to do in terms of create instabilities, create different types of structures and formations. So this is what this first light fusion is explicitly talking about. They say, rather than attempting to avoid instabilities, we harness them, working with complexity from the start. And they say the use of intense shock waves to crush gas-filled cavities, including asymmetric collapses that generate that concentrate energy in space and time. So they're using certain properties of the plasma to, under certain conditions, kind of collapse on itself, create a shock wave condition. They want to actually encourage that to occur and concentrate the shock waves to a high, to compress the fuel in a small region to generate the fusion reaction that way. Some really interesting stuff. You know, I definitely want to look more into what they're working on. So they've come out of Oxford, and as reported in the Bloomberg article, they've raised at least $25 million to fund their research. And to highlight just one more, this is something that LaRouche PAC contributor Michael Carr wrote about and we published, I believe, just a week ago, Helion Energy. This is another startup. This one has backing from Peter Thiel, operating near Seattle. And what they're looking at is fusion reactions. They're also looking at kind of operating within the, trying to work within the properties and the characteristics inherent to fusion plasmas and how they react, creating toroidal donut-shaped structures of the plasma and actually creating two of them on opposite ends of a cylinder and firing them at each other, which is something that is very related also to some of what Mr. LaRouche was promoting and some of the scientists working with Mr. LaRouche were working on back in the 80s. So you can just get a sense that LaRouche and his Fusion Energy Foundation were very much at the frontiers of a lot of these areas that are finally now getting some further support and development. And what's interesting about them is they're looking at helium-3. So this is a type of helium, a form of helium as the fuel, which, without getting into all the details, and we can get into it in some of the Q&A, allows for all of the energy released by the fusion reactions to remain in the plasma itself, not escape, and opens up new capabilities for directly converting the energy in the plasma into electricity. And so what you're talking about there is a whole nother kind of revolutionary leap in terms of electricity generation, where with coal-fired power plants, nuclear fission, standard nuclear fission power plants, and even a lot of the designs for first-generation fusion power plants, like systems that are designed to build off of what ITER is doing in Europe. All of those, you're really looking at generating heat from the reaction, having that heat boil water, turn it into steam, and run that steam through a turbine to spin the turbine to generate electricity. So even though you have different sources of the energy involved in those different systems, they all kind of still operate on that heat transferring to water or potentially some other gas in certain designs, and using that to spin a turbine, and that spinning turbine will generate and induce electricity and generate electricity that way, right? The efficiencies of that are limited. You really only end up converting 35, maybe 40% with some advanced designs and potentially using other gases besides vaporized water. You might get into like higher mid 40s. I don't know what the limits are. But you're generally talking about less than 50%, probably significantly less than 50% of the energy generated by the combustion of the fuel being converted into electricity. A lot of it just ends up getting lost as waste heat. With what you might call second, third generation fusion fuels, again, like helium-3, you open up something completely new where you kind of cut out that whole heat driving a gas to spin a turbine process. And you can look at other ways to directly induce an electrical current in systems surrounding the plasma itself, or potentially get the plasma to emit certain precise radio frequencies that can then be captured by antenna type systems at much higher efficiencies to generate electricity that way. So instead of having 35, 40, maybe 45% of the energy generated by your fuel end up getting converted into electricity, you can be talking about 60, 70, 80%, maybe even higher of the energy produced by your fusion reaction getting converted into electricity. So not only is fusion far more energy dense in terms of the energy available in the fuel, it can be far more efficient with advanced fusion systems that have some of these direct conversion technologies, directly converting the energy in the fusion plasma into electricity through one of these modes. And that kind of opens up a whole new domain of activity. And this is, again, something Mr. LaRouche worked on extensively and even talked about as really could be the basis for a new industrial revolution. A whole domain of what you might call, what some people were calling directed energy technologies, where you're working with fusion plasmas related to fusion technologies. You're working with high energy laser systems, like we're talking about with NIF and other variations of that, like the Lawrence Livermore system. And you're moving away from the domain of largely heat or mechanical based manufacturing or materials processing into systems that more directly use refined characteristics of the plasmas and the materials and the laser systems, the interaction of those systems in a more precise way. If you want a very simple example of this kind of thing that we all use every day, you have a microwave. If you want to boil a cup of water in a microwave, it's a lot quicker and it takes a lot less energy overall than doing that on the stovetop. The stovetop just generates heat, and that heat transfers to the water, heats up the water, boils the water. A microwave emits a very certain frequency electromagnetic radiation that doesn't just heat everything, it specifically interacts with certain molecules. It's tuned to resonate with very specific molecules in what you put in the microwave to generate, to induce heat that way, right? So you could think of it as a simple form of a directed energy technology. You're not just using a full spectrum of heat application. You're kind of using a certain very specific electromagnetic frequency to resonate with a very specific molecular structure, and you're getting a transfer of energy in that way, right? So it's a much more tuned process. And that's something that could be opened up in a very, very broad way with the fusion economy. And probably the most kind of one of the pinnacle, most exciting, probably best known examples of this is this discussion, this design, this idea of the fusion torch, where you could put, you connected to a fusion reaction fusion reactor system, you could generate high enough temperatures of plasma that you could then put in any waste material you want and separate that waste material into its constituent elements and even isotopes, right? So you could take the capabilities of the fusion plasma to break down nuclear waste, chemical waste, whatever kind of material waste, and you can get out of it completely refined concentrations of elements and even isotopes that you can then use as resources for the economy. That's something that is a pretty advanced system that would come with a really advanced fusion economy, but gives you a sense of where we could go to, and how these kinds of fusion technologies begin to apply not just to electricity generation, which is incredibly important, but also into all kinds of areas of materials production, materials processing, raw materials processing and concentration. And there's really a lot more that can be said on that, but I think I'll just leave it there and open up the Q&A discussion, because what you're looking at with this type of fusion technology is, again, back in the context of the physical economy, is a continuation in this negentropic process, right? To bring it fully back around, this is what we need for the economy today. We need to go the opposite of the Green New Deal, right? Not lower energy at flux density, higher energy flux density. We need an energy policy that expresses itself in the physical economy by increasing and dramatically increasing the electricity produced per unit of material input and per worker, per operative in the economy. That's a negentropic process, right? The opposite of the Green New Deal. We want to increase the electricity generation by the electricity sector without needing to dramatically increase the capital inputs and the labor inputs into the electricity sector. That's nuclear power. That's fusion power into the future. We start, getting more investments into these fusion programs we were just looking at, they can get demonstration systems on the line in the next 10 years. And they can get second generation, third generation systems developed in the next 10 or 15 years after that. Then you're looking at, in 25, 30 years, commercialized fusion efficient, cheap electricity generation from fusion systems that can be implemented in a large scale. And then opening up this entire other domain of material processing, new material generation, new material production through fusion and related directed energy technologies. And that's kind of a larger subject that maybe we can delve more into potentially next time. So I will leave it there, and I'm sure some people have some good input and questions and thoughts on the LaRouche PAC program in opposition to the Biden program.